Hello and welcome to Pod in My Backyard, the podcast for those of us interested in housing issues who actually, want to get stuff built. Thank you for joining me today. My name's Eve McQuillan. I'm a housing activist, been around for a long time in the private rented sector and pretty much had enough of it. And I'm joined today by Sam Richards from Britain Remade. So thank you very much for being with me.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us a bit about yourself.
So I run this outfit called Britain Remade, which is a campaign to make it easier to build in Britain. And I set it up 3 years ago after a time in government when I became just increasingly frustrated at our inability to get anything done. And I was thinking, why is this? And is it because we have particularly useless politicians? Well, it may be that. It certainly feels like that. But I don't think it is that. I think it's because the incentives for our politicians are often wrong, that they would hear from people who didn't want stuff to get built, who didn't want to see new houses going up nearby, or didn't want a new train line going through their patch, or see wind farms on the horizon. But they were much less likely to hear from the people who actually wanted us to crack on, build the homes and the energy and the transport infrastructure that we need. So I set up Britain Remade a few years ago. We've now got 35,000 supporters across the country. And in addition to that, we produce new policy reports that we bring to ministers and officials and bring them some ideas for how we actually, some practical policies for how we actually get Britain building again. So that's me and that's us.
Brilliant work. Thank you, Sam, and thanks for being with us. So, if we kick off, so I have been scrolling away reading your reports, and I'm interested in your latest one that you did with Community, the trade union representing, among other people, steel workers who've had, a bit of a win recently. So, we've been reading about your report, which we've heard a lot from Keir Starmer and the likes about backing the builders, not the blockers. But this is about the workers versus the blockers. Tell me a little bit about why you've taken that approach.
Yeah, I think that there's a risk with conversations around planning reform that it can feel like on one side of the debate you've got the NIMBYs, and on the other side of the debate you've got people who work in think tanks, people in their 20s and 30s in London, people, academics from the LSE. But actually, this is a conversation not just about people in their 20s and 30s who want to own a house in London, but people right across the country. This is about the guys who I met up in Cumbria who used to work at the previous Sellafield nuclear power plant and would love for there to be another nuclear power plant in Cumbria, but it's just far too hard to get one built. This is about the people in Leeds who've been waiting decades for a tram to finally be built there. This is about
Cancelled in 2010.
Right. This is about people in cities, not just London, but across the country, from Manchester to Edinburgh, where housing is far too expensive. So this is about workers right across the country, and we teamed up with Community, the trade union, who've been doing great work on this previously with this, as you say, this new report that sets out the benefits for people right across the country and the jobs benefits that will come if the government is able to deliver on its ambitions of clean power by 2030 and 1.5 million new homes.
Brilliant work. Thank you very much. I think so for me, this workers versus blockers thing is important because when we talk about builders versus blockers, you get the kind of classic NIMBY pushback is, it's just to make money for the property development industry, why do we care? And the point of the planning system is it's meant to deliver homes for all of us to live in. It's meant to deliver infrastructure for all of us to use. And it is really the rest of society versus the blockers. Why can't we have nice things? Why can't we have good public transport? Why can't we have affordable homes? Because we haven't built enough of this stuff and we've tied ourselves up in regulatory knots. So thank you for that retaking of the split between the workers and the blockers. So onto the report. Paints a bit of a bleak picture of Britain today. From your point of view, what are our big problems and how do we fix them?
Well, look, I mean, as I think, it seems like you may already agree, and it seems like a lot of the people who
might have been biased in how I pick the contributors
may agree. But fundamentally, we have the highest industrial energy costs in the world and domestic bills that are at a similar level. We have the most expensive housing here in London, in Europe, as well as it being the bleakest and the smallest. it is the most expensive place in the world to build new nuclear. We're currently building the most expensive nuclear power plant ever constructed at Hinkley. Why is all of this the case? It's because we haven't built stuff and it's too hard to build stuff. Fundamentally, foundationally, underpinning the reason why our country feels like it's broken and nothing works and you get stuck in traffic and you can't get to work on time and you can't see friends and family and your bills are too high and the rent is too high. Underpinning all of this is our failure to build the stuff that we need. That is, as I say, that is foundational to everything that's going wrong with the country at the moment.
Super, thank you. I agree with you, unsurprisingly. But on to jobs. So key focus, and we talk a lot about 1.5 million homes.
Yeah.
Great, admirable aim. And there's a lot of talk about growing the economy at the moment. I would say that some of that talk is perhaps a little bit kind of nebulous and away from people's real lives. And, you know, a 0.5% increase in GDP, well, that's nice, but what does that mean? For me, what does it mean for people who feel underemployed or feel frustrated with poor quality work, bad bosses and insecurity? So can you tell me a little bit more about some of the employment benefits of this building boom that we would like to see?
So this was one of the central bits of the report, was some economic modelling that we did about the jobs impact of getting Britain building again, as I say, meeting those core government targets that hopefully will be met by the planning reforms that are coming through with the planning infrastructure bill. And we found that, as perhaps I think people would expect, there is a huge boom in construction jobs. You get basically 250,000 construction jobs, and these are good, well-paid, secure jobs. But I actually think beyond the construction jobs, and that's obviously really important, that's great, but beyond that is then the additional, I think, nearly 100,000 jobs that come in other sectors, like retail, and they come because we're actually building homes where people want to live near to other jobs that are available. And I think that one of the things that is lost in the debate around planning at the moment is the fact that our economy is so severely underperforming, and firms often talk about being unable to hire the best people because the best people can't move to where the right jobs for them are. So, yeah, it's absolutely brilliant that we will get this huge boom in good jobs in construction, but more than that, it unlocks jobs in other sectors as people are able to live actually where they want and live near the best jobs.
Yeah, and it unlocks jobs across the country as well. For too long, you know, we've had an economy very heavily centred on the service industry in London, etc. And what that does is create some very kind of high-level jobs. You need a lot of education, difficult to get into, and that's great for some people. But then we see a lot of jobs which are very kind of gig economy type jobs, not very secure, not providing people that ability to progress, and you get people who are kind of stuck underemployed. And across the country, we see areas where there isn't a great deal of economic development because we have this economic model that is really concentrating economic growth in small areas of the country, and that's not fair. And whichever party you voted for at the last election, they were all saying that they were going to solve this. But construction is actually a way that you can start to do that and spread that economic development around the country. But I would say, you know, a little plug for the SME builders in this if you really wanted that economic development being spread.
Totally right. And yeah, as I'm sure you talked about previously, the way that our planning system currently works makes it so hard, makes it almost impossible because of the number of regulatory hurdles that there are to it. It's so hard for the little guy. It's so hard for the small firms
to get investment and actually keep going. Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you. So one of the, if you think about the debates that are being had now about the planning and infrastructure bill, which I think, you know, BI bill, there's some good stuff in there. Could it go further? Yeah. But there's some good stuff in there. But there's clearly this issue around balancing development needs and environmental protection. You talked a bit about this in your report.
Yes.
What would you like to see the government do?
So I think in this conversation, it's really worth remembering that alongside our failure to build the homes that we need, and the transport links that we need, and the clean energy that we need to tackle climate change, the biggest driver of biodiversity loss, we are also failing to protect British nature. England is one of the most nature depleted countries on Earth. Every key biodiversity indicator, from farmland birds to insect life, is in decline. And that's happening under the current regime, under the current framework of environmental protection. So we currently have the worst of both worlds.
Why is that happening?
It's in no small part down to the way that the protections work is done on a site-by-site, species-by-species basis. We know that the best approach to protecting nature, you actually need a sort of a decent chunk of area in which nature can restore. And you can't do it on this, we are going to protect 200 bats here, and we're going to protect exactly that. It needs to be done on a landscape scale. But the way that we go about it is not that. The way that we go about it is, okay, there are 300 Bechstein's bats in this wood that is nearby where the HS2 line is going to be going through. Not actually that wood, but those bats may come across and they may come foraging. And so what we then have to do, even though there is no evidence that this proposed tunnel is going to actually work to protect those bats, we're going to require HS2 naturally and say, well, look, these particular bats in this place are protected in law, so you have to basically take all feasible efforts to protect them, and they, this is how you end up with the grotesque chaos of £100 million bat tunnel being installed.
Great tunnel, though.
So, sorry?
It's a great tunnel. It looks really cool.
It does look cool. But apparently in the design of this tunnel, it's been so designed that there is this mesh, which means that it might even be the case that the bats will still be able to crawl in, but not be able to get out. No. So we may have created a bat killing machine with this £100 million tunnel. But there is a very serious point here, as I say, which is that this mad approach is not protecting British nature at the same time as leading to crazy, disproportionate mitigation schemes like the tunnel. So what's the way through? Well, actually what the government is doing with this move to a strategic approach to nature protection is the right one. So in the bill, they've said that they're going to introduce these new things called environmental delivery plans. And so rather than, if you're a developer trying to build some homes, or if you're trying to build a new railway line or a new power plant, rather than having to do a kind of species by species mitigation in response to all the potential sites that you're impacting, you pay into a pot earlier on in the process. And the old regulations fall away, and assuming that your payment sort of compensates in the round for nature protection, then you can crack on and build. The problem with the way that the bill is currently written, I'm sorry, this is possibly intensely boring, but
no comment.
but it is important, because the problem with the way that the bill is currently written is that the old regulations actually remain in place under the new strategic framework that they're bringing in. And if you're unable to show that there has been no net loss per species, not just in the round, but per species, then the old regulations kick in. And so we could still have bat tunnels, and we could still have, I'm sure you've heard about the fish disco at Hinckley.
Disco, yeah.
So these are the speakers that EDF are having to install underwater.
What do they play?
Baby Shark. Deter. It's like a small fishing vessel's worth of fish from swimming up the pipes of the power station. But we could still have these egregious examples, these disproportionate examples under the new scheme, unless they make a change that allows you to properly, as I say, sort of consider nature in the round, pay into a pot that is linked to the 25-year Environment Plan or legally binding targets in the Environment Act, and say, look, we're going to contribute to those broad targets. The government has said this is broadly what we want what to happen for British nature. And if you pay into that pot, then you don't have to go through the incredibly lengthy and disproportionate process that developers currently have to go through. So that would be the right solution, and would unlock billions of pounds for nature restoration, which we dearly need.
I mean, absolutely. I agree we dearly need it. I agree with that strategic level approach. I appreciate, the motivation, if you like. I am skeptical that in practice it will actually work, and that things won't be delivered incredibly slowly. And I would, I guess, like to see, it's about the system working, really, isn't it? It's about the nature protection system working. It's about the planning system and the building system working, and those things not kind of grinding to a halt and not being JR'd into oblivion by people who want to stop everything happening.
Totally. And there's a risk here, right? Which is that the people, the body responsible for essentially making sure that this system works is Natural England. Now, Natural England is full of amazing people I know from my time in government, and the chair of Natural England, Tony Juniper, is an amazing conservationist. But first and foremost, they are conservationists.
And do they have the capacity to do this?
Do they have the capacity to do this is a very real question. And then linked to that, their objectives, very understandably, like their priorities will always be conservation. And the challenge, and we've seen this over lots of different areas of government policy, is that ultimately when you empower certain arm's length bodies, quangos, to decide, in these sort of cases whether developments are going to go ahead or not. But their real objective, they only have one main objective, and that is conservation. And they're not as bothered about the growth and the development side of things. Then, you inevitably end up with a skewed decision. Whereas something like that, I would say, should be taken at a ministerial level. And should not be outsourced to these quasi-state bodies where decisions are taken by bureaucrats. They should be taken by democratically elected government ministers, elected by the people who get to then weigh up the trade-offs and decide, look, in certain situations, you know what, we may be willing to accept a few bats may be hard in the making of this film in order to deliver the growth that British people desperately need, but we're then going to, create this additional sanctuary or this additional wetland or this whatever nature restoration project elsewhere as recompense for that. But that should be a decision for ministers and not sit with this quango.
Yeah, the capacity of the state to deliver. Issue as old as time. But there you go. So I want to chat more now about some of the policies that you advocate in your report. And to express an interest, you talk about the Aberfeldy estate, which is near where I live, and I worked to support the Aberfeldy region for a time. But what you advocate in the report is a planning designation, if you like, called estate passports. Tell me about what that is and what would it improve.
So across London, most of the social housing in London was built after the war. It is in pretty poor condition. It's pretty leaky, very low energy efficiency standards, and it's also not very, I think most people would agree, not particularly beautiful, and it's not really dense either, surprisingly, given that some of it is tower blocks, but it's often you've got tower blocks and then big empty open spaces. It's actually significantly less dense than your classic Georgian terrace houses in West London or your Edwardian mansion blocks. So there is a huge opportunity to upgrade the social housing stock of London and at the same time add in additional homes. We think that on the existing social housing estates of London, you could add an additional over 500,000 homes, about 550,000 homes could be added to London, and this could be essentially free. You can pay for this using the value uplift, and to be honest, using what is the crazy state of the London property market. Now, I know as
would
someone
that
who
add
has
up at the time, because estate regions at the moment require quite a lot of grants to get them going.
I can see that, and I look, as I say, like I can see from your experience with Aberfeldy that you may have some skepticism. But look, firstly, this is wildly popular everywhere. I think there have been like 30 votes, and 29 is had kind of like North Korean levels of popularity in the vote. People are hugely up for this, understandably, because the people who are there at the moment will get an upgraded property that is going to be cheaper to run, it's going to have lower bills, it's going to be more pleasant, it's going to be warmer, and also it's then good for us because we get new homes in the process. So I think the policy then would be a passport that means that if the local residents vote for renewal of their estate and upgrading their estate, then they're, aside from a few sort of design principles that you would expect and a few sort of restrictions around possibly energy efficiency standards and safety standards and so on, essentially it is granted automatic planning approval for upgrading. And as I say, it's good for the local residents and it's massively good for the city and increasing the number of housing stock. But I can tell, I'm interested to hear more about your experience.
So I'm like, So I think in principle and, democratically, if you're an elected councillor, you're responsible for a planning department and 97% of residents, what's the Aberfeldy ballot? I think it was 97% pro and 91% turnout, which is a pretty big mandate. You're going to want to get that through. And indeed, I think a lot of problems in planning come down to kind of political leadership and lack thereof. But my scepticism, I guess, is that with estate region ballots, you can promise an awful lot of things to get that positive ballot. And there isn't a check and balance in place to make sure those things that were promised are delivered. Or at the time they're promised, have you checked to see if they are deliverable? And a lot of estate regen ballots may well depend on what's called equity gifting to leaseholders, where you have people who've bought their flat under the right to buy, or they've bought their flat from somebody who bought it under the right to buy, more likely now, given that a lot of, particularly in London, a lot of the right to buy sales happened in the 80s and the 90s. It's not a huge loss now into right to buy. So people have bought their flat and they've, maybe they've lived there for a long while and they're offered either to be bought out or they can come back later. But of course, the flat that they then own will be a lot more expensive. So you have a decision to make. Do you basically give those leaseholders the money that their flat is worth and say, off you pop and they go and buy something else? Or do you say, no, we want to keep that community together, so we want to give them the right to return, but then how are you paying for that? Are you requiring people to take out mortgages to pay for the work for their share, or are you saying, actually, no, you can have that for free? And I think the issue is to get ballots through, people are often overpromised. And the issue with that is that then hits the social housing viability and makes it much harder to deliver the social housing uplift, which is what local authorities really want, given the amount of people on the waiting list. So I like it in principle because I like estate regions. They can actually be a great example of planning done well, because they're often really well designed with local communities in mind. There's a lot of community consultation that goes on. Aberfeldy Estate, loads of community consultation work, loads of really good local economic development at work and job creation work there as well. But I think it is very difficult to get them over the line financially, and seems a little bit too good to be true.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that's a very fair analysis, and I think you're right that of course you will need some grant money to grease the wheels, but I still think that if you compare bang for buck, the amount of both private but also social housing that you can get from a small amount of basically seed capital for an estate regen project versus if you were just attempting to build some new stock off greenfield land or wherever. It's a whole different ballgame. Yeah,
I mean, compare it also. Estate regen is in the places where people want to live.
Exactly that.
And it's often can help people who are in overcrowded accommodation get new housing in the community where they live, where they want to be. Yeah. But it's a difficult thing to make happen. I think what's interesting about the Aberfeldy case, though, is that it is such a nakedly political rejection.
Mm.
So there was a change in administration. The new administration didn't like the Housing Association because they had links to the previous administration, and it was just an obviously nakedly political rejection. And it was called in by Sadiq Khan, and quite rightly so, because it was ridiculous, the kind of misuse of the planning system that we see now and again when stuff isn't popular, and we see councillors just putting forward ridiculous reasons. It was rejected because it might add an extra minute to a car journey in the local area. Now this is, the convergence of the A12 and the A13. There are traffic jams there all the time. It's near the Blackwall Tunnel. I mean, come on, but this kind of, I think what it illustrates is, how do you get political leadership within local authorities actually working well and actually working in the interests of actual working people, as opposed to people who don't want something to be built because perhaps they want to keep house prices high. How do you make that leadership change?
Yeah, no, indeed. And it also speaks to, I think, the important changes in the planning bill around planning committees.
Yeah.
And I think it's perfectly right to say that local councillors have their say at the point of approving the local plans and do not need another opportunity to stick their oar in.
Interesting. I think sometimes, then you're complicated by a change of administration and having to approve stuff based on someone else's local plan. It's not particularly democratic. It's not great, because, if your councillors are putting forward policies that you don't like, you should be able to vote them out and get in some new guys who've got some other ideas. And if then they're then tied in, that's not ideal democratically. But also, there are a lot of conservative council officers out there. Like conservative as in small c, conservative, don't want anything to change, want to conserve and protect things. There are a lot of council officers who see themselves as the kind of defenders of heritage, of the environment, etc., etc., against a development industry that is damaging. Yeah. How do you overcome that just through a system of delegation change?
Yeah, it's a very reasonable challenge.
Yeah, I think it's one that the government needs to get to grips with. I think that for me, there's a cultural change point about how do we get the voices of people who benefit from new housing into the planning system, whether it is officers or whether it's politicians. Yeah. And at the moment, we have a situation where everybody who voted for one of the three major parties at the last election voted for a party that said they were going to build 1.5 million new homes. Right. There were slight tweaks in how they were going to do it, but generally, house building was key to the agenda of all three major parties. And yet, on a local level, we have, but my view. And it's ridiculous, whether it's, a representative or an officer being concerned about somebody's view, and you're like, for God's sake, have you seen the waiting list? But there you go. Yeah. So we ramble on. Anyway, thank you very much for that, Sam. I want to talk to you just before we go about clean energy and nuclear, because you've been doing a lot of work on this space. Yeah. Britain has, was it twice as expensive in terms of its industrial energy capacity than in France? Tell me about this. We're in a pretty dire state.
So it's the most expensive industrial energy in the world, and it is twice as expensive in France, in no small part because France successfully built out a fleet of nuclear reactors in the late 20th century, incredibly safely. Nuclear is the safest form of electricity generation on the planet in terms of deaths. More people die constructing wind turbines. Obviously, there's a tiny number of people who die constructing wind turbines, but more people die from that than have died as a result of nuclear energy. And yet, we've got to this situation where, as I said, Hinkley is the most expensive nuclear power plant ever constructed on the planet. But it didn't always used to be like this. 20 years ago, the nuclear power plants, 30 years ago, the nuclear power plants that we built in the 80s and 90s were half the price of that. And in the 50s and 60s, when we built the world's first commercial nuclear power plant up in Cumbria, it was a quarter of the price of the ones that we're building now. So clearly, there's nothing inherent in the technology that means that it has to cost as much as it currently is. It is the additional rules and regulations that we have added to the building process over decades, that and some of that is the environmental rules that we talked about earlier, some of that is also in the approach to safety. Some of that is in the approach to building regs. But yeah, an interesting comparison here is South Korea. So South Korea has managed to get their cost curve going in the right direction. And some of that is, as I say, is to do with those the different burdens of regulation that we place on our nuclear constructors that South Korea doesn't. But there is also a question here about the role of the state in this that I think a lot of people on the right ignore. Because South Korea, yes, has a much better regulatory environment, but they also build in fleet. And it is the state, essentially taxpayers, paying to buy in bulk. And as a result, the developers learn by doing, and you have the skills that come with that, the good jobs that come with that. But you don't have to, as literally when they were starting up building at Hinkley, they were like, we just don't have any welders who can do this, and they had to create the skills colleges to do this. And it's why committing to Sizewell, for example, is so important, so that we don't lose those skills and then have to find them again in 30 years' time. But I think that there is a role for the state here, as well as recognising that on the one hand, we have added all of these regulations that's made it incredibly hard to build, also recognising on the other hand that there is a role for the state here in committing and buying in bulk and committing in fleet to doing this at scale. And that is ultimately what worked in France, and that is what is working in South Korea too.
Well, I hope that you are right, and I hope that is something that the new government is able to take on, because there's a lot about mission-based government, and it sounds a bit cheesy. It sounds perhaps something that a management consultant might come up with, but you know what, the state and the private sector working together to actually deliver the stuff we need is kind of, I don't know, to me that seems like a good idea, and perhaps a good use for Great British Energy to be doing the work that is perhaps too risky for the private sector, too big for the private sector, and putting in place that infrastructure, if you like, within the energy system to allow and facilitate development further down the line, which is what happened with renewable energy, for instance, quite successfully actually under the previous Tory government. They did expand the number of wind farms, etc. They did put resources into that, and it has now become financially viable for private companies to start doing that work. So it's a role that the state can have, and the state can do successfully in countries that manage their economy perhaps a little bit better than we do.
Totally. But you mentioned wind farms. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a core Britain Remade stat, which is that it takes 13 years to get an offshore wind farm up and running.
And people go crazy about them.
But it takes just 2 to actually build them. So the 11-year gap is all in grid connection and planning. That speaks to, and we can say that it's been 30 years since we built a new nuclear power plant, that it's that across the energy system, there are all these examples that explain why our energy bills are so high and so unnecessarily high. We know that clean energy, that renewable power is cheap and getting cheaper, and yet because of the delays in getting it built, we're not seeing the benefits from it yet. So if the government is going to achieve, and it's an incredibly ambitious target, but if the government is going to achieve its Clean Power 2030, having a net zero grid by the end of the decade, the only way they're going to do this, and I hope, and I'm confident, that Chris Stark, who's in charge of Clean Power 2030, and Ed Miliband, have been having the conversations with Matt Pennycook and others about the planning bill and making sure that it's going to do what they need to do, because there is no way that they're going to be able to hit that target if they don't dramatically curtail that 11 years.
What are they doing for 11 years?
Well, a large part of it is compiling huge environmental impact assessments. So the Boreas wind farm off the Norfolk coast had an environmental impact assessments over 40,000 pages, longer than the combined works of Tolstoy and Proust. And so there's gigantic environmental impact assessments, which obviously flow from the environmental regulations. There's then often legal challenges. I mean, the Prime Minister, at the start of the year, I think, in a speech making the case for planning reform, raised the case of a wind farm that had to compile 4,000 planning documents, not a 4,000 page document, 4,000 documents, and even after that point was JR'd and had another 2-year delay, stuck in the courts. And so that's obviously why the changes that the government want to make to judicial review and reduce the number of opportunities to bring these projects to the courts is right. I still fear that they don't go far enough. I don't know if you're aware of the Aarhus Convention.
I'm not. No. Tell me about the Aarhus Convention.
But this is an international agreement that we're part of that caps the costs of those bringing lawsuits against their governments on environmental grounds at an incredibly low level. I think it's about £5,000. And as a result, we've seen a huge number of uptake. The majority of infrastructure projects in the UK, basically every road project, are now JR'd because it is effectively free for private citizens to do so. So that is something that is going to need to be looked at, not least as we actually account for a hugely disproportionate number of Aarhus cases. There are like 28 countries in the convention, and we account for basically half of them. So clearly, something is going wrong with the interaction between the British legal system and this convention. A long-winded way of saying it's far too easy to sue the government at the moment when they're trying to build the infrastructure that we need. We're not saying that it should be impossible, but it probably does need to be a little bit harder if we are going to actually build the energy, the roads and the homes that we need.
I think, interesting question. I think for me, it's how do we get the politics where that doesn't happen? How do we get the politics where our elected representatives, but actually our society are not doing this because we buy into this vision of a society where we can have plenty. But thank you very much, Sam, for joining me today. It's been great to have you. Nice to chat. Before we go, just a quick question for you. What's your one dream housing policy? Anything in the world. You're Prime Minister for a day.
I'm gonna stick to my guns. And I'm going to say estate regen passports.
Estate regen passports. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And cheers for listening, guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me.